2025 is here, and this is my current road bike collection. Starting off with this bike that you see right here, my 2018 Wabi Classic in Midnight Blue. This bike is absolutely awesome. It's crazy to think that I've had it for just coming up on 8 years at this point. Pros of this bike, it's all steel, which means it's super strong, much stronger than carbon, but it also is going to ride a lot nicer than something like an aluminum road bike. Compared to some other bikes that are 4 or 5 times the price, it is extremely cheap. You could pick up a complete Wabi for just about $1,000, and it being single speed with rim brakes just means that there is no fuss. This bike, out of all of my other bikes that I've ever ridden, has given me no maintenance issues at all. Lubricate the chain, clean the rim brakes, pump up air in the tires, and pretty much you're all set to go. It is super fast. Maintenance is a no-brainer. Pros of the Wabi Classic: it's simple, it's robust, and it's cheap to replace, meaning that if it falls, it's not going to crack like a carbon bike, and if something does happen to it, it's not going to be $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 to replace it like a high-end carbon race bike. It's only going to be around about $1,000 like you're seeing it spec'd right here. You can get them complete straight from Wabi, which is absolutely awesome. Now, the ride quality on this thing is absolutely amazing. It's agile because it's a super racy geometry, but is also extremely smooth. One of my smoothest bikes that I actually have, even with 28mm tires at 85, 90 PSI, which is kind of insane. You still do feel those big road bumps, but when you're going over slight imperfections, the bike just feels very springy. It just feels very muted. Nothing rides like steel, and this thing being full steel, including a steel fork, just means that it's super smooth over rough roads, especially if you're riding around in a place such as New York City. Maintenance on this bike is also another big pro. It being a single speed just means that it is super simple and super easy to maintain, and the parts are also considerably cheaper. These single speed chains on these bikes can range anywhere from $12 to $25, whereas an 11 speed or a 12 speed chain, you're looking from anywhere from $50 to $100, and you get free wheels and cogs pretty cheap for it, depending on if you want to ride fixed gear or if you want to just go basic single speed like I have chosen to do. Even if you do want to go a bit higher end with something nicer like a White Industries freewheel, you're going to be able to pick up that for $100 versus $150 to $200 for an 11 or 12 speed cassette that goes in the back. Not to mention, no derailleurs on here for the front and the rear, just keeps the cost way down, and also you don't have to worry about adjusting cables, charging batteries. All of those maintenance items are just completely omitted, making this bike by far the easiest bike that I've ever had to maintain. It also has rim brakes, which are cable actuated and very easy to maintain. All you need are a pair of cable cutters and an Allen key set, and you could literally overhaul the entire brake system. I've done it a couple times already on this bike and on my other Wabi, which is right back there. You don't have to worry about bleeding your hydraulic brakes, adjusting your disc brake pads if you have a bent rotor, different size rotors. Overall, the rim brake system is just a much easier, much cheaper system to maintain. With that being said, let's go ahead and segue into the cons of this bike. And the first con is going to be those rim brakes. Like I said, it's super subjective, but rim brakes, while they are super easy to maintain, I have had to clean these brakes constantly. And even if you just ride through a puddle and you get water on your rims or water on your brake pads, you're gonna have to take your brake pads out, sand them and clean them, and sand and clean, well, not sand, clean the actual rims themselves. Otherwise, you're gonna get that insane, really just horrible noise of the scratching of the brake pads on the rims. And when I hear that, it's just, I feel like my bike is just eating away at its rims, and if I don't clean it after a couple of rides, my rims are going to be totally trash. Probably exaggerating this in my head, but it is a pretty serious downside, and although the maintenance is easy, I've definitely had to spend a lot more time cleaning these than any of my disc brake bikes that I have owned. Now, I mentioned that the tire clearance was actually pretty good on this bike, but I would say that if you have a disc brake bike, you'll be able to fit at least a 35mm tire, and those disc brake bikes are usually going to be a little bit more of a relaxed geometry. It's great that you can actually fit 32mm wide tires on this bike, but because the rear end is so tight over here, when you put a 32, I don't know if I said 35 before, if you put a 32mm tire in, it's going to get very close around here, the seat tube, the tire is almost going to start to rub. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to lengthen the chain, push the rear wheel all the way back almost to the end of the dropouts. But then if you want to run something a bit narrower like a 25 or 28 millimeter tire, you're going to have to shorten the chain again. So while it is nice that you can fit 32 millimeter tires on this bike, an actual measured 32, not just a tire that says 32 and only blows up to a 28 or 30, it's not really the most ideal setup I've found. A single speed is also a much bigger commitment than a bike that has variable gears, just because as you get your fitness up and as you get stronger as a cyclist, you're more than likely going to want to start to change the chainring size and the rear freewheel size into a more harder gear. That way you can go faster, you're going to have a much easier time just cranking up those hills. After just a few weeks off of your bike, that gear ratio might start to feel too heavy for you, and you're going to have to change back to a easier or lighter gear ratio, which is just something that it's a lot of switching back and forth. And if you just go with a geared bike, it just means you're going to spend more time in your easier gears. And then as you get stronger, you start riding again, this weather gets nice out, you're just going to be upshifting a lot more. That's definitely something you're going to want to be mindful. Also with this bike, it is a very aggressive, very racy bike. I don't have a problem with this since I did go with a slightly smaller size, and I found that Wabi is pretty much dead on accurate when it comes to their sizes. I was going to get a 58, however I got the 55, and even if I don't ride this bike for a couple of weeks, I get on it. For the first 10 minutes it feels a little bit aggressive, but then I can get used to it pretty fast. But if you're someone that maybe you're not that flexible, definitely try to ride one of these bikes or look at geometrygeeks.com. I'll put a link down there. Put in whatever size bike you're currently riding or whatever size bike you think you should be, and you're going to be able to compare it. My recommendation would be to go with a shorter size, and you could always raise the handlebars or ride something like a flat bar if you want, but that definitely is going to be a downside depending on how flexible you are and how much you can tolerate that racy geometry. Now, would I buy it again? Absolutely, yes, I would buy this again. For $1,000, I've had a bike that every single time I get on it, I am super satisfied. I'm always amazed at how well it rides. By the way, I'm not sponsored by Wabi. It's just something I always think, how much can a single speed, narrow tire clearance, rim brake, racy bike really do? Can it really handle the hills? Every time I've taken it on the hills, sure, it's not as easy as just shifting down to your lowest gear on a geared road bike. However, just start standing up, swinging the bike up and down. The bike flies up the hills. I even took this on gravel, medium gravel with some super narrow Continental race tires in a size 28, which really only measured up to a 25 this past summer. And I did lower the tire pressure on those, but the bike still did the gravel beautifully. I didn't feel like I was being held back, but the pro of that was when I had to ride on the road, the bike just is like a rocket ship on the road. I've said it before and I'll say it again, this is the fastest bike I own. Yes, it's not as fast as a geared bike because you can't shift up as much, but as far as acceleration, as far as ride quality, maybe I'm not expecting a lot since it's a single speed bike and it costs $1,000. And when I come off of a $5,000 or $6,000 bike like my TCR, I'm like, whatever, it's probably gonna be okay. But my expectations are always here and the bike always performs here. So yes, absolutely, I would buy this again. Now that brings us to the second bike that we're going to talk about, the Wabi Thunder and Desert Turquoise. Got this bike almost about 2 years ago, so I've had it for quite a while. This is just proof of how much fun and how much I value my Wabi Classic, which now switched spaces with this. I did go ahead and buy another Wabi just because I wanted something that could fit slightly wider tires and something that I could ride more as a chill, off-road, wide tire cruiser, commuter type bike, whatever you want to call it. Pros of this bike: simple, cheap, robust, easy to replace. Shares a lot of the same pros with the Wabi Classic we were just talking about. No disc brakes, no variable gears, no carbon fork, no carbon seat posts, so that just means that it's going to ride very well, and it's also going to be not just cheap to buy, cheap to replace. And actually this one I've locked up a couple of times in New York City, in Manhattan nonetheless, with 2 or 3 heavy-duty locks, mind you. And although I would be devastated if it ever did get a bike stolen, having a bike stolen that's only $1,000 as compared to something that's $4,000, $5,000, or $6,000 is just a lot easier to digest. So those are the pros. Now we're going to talk about the cons. First con is going to be these brakes. By far, I have never been so frustrated with a pair of brakes that I've had on any bicycles, including my BMX bike with rim brakes, my disc brakes, which were first generation on my Felt VR30 that we'll talk about a little bit later, any of my hydraulic brakes, any of the disc rotors that bent, by far the wide tire V-brake or cantilever style rim brakes of the yesteryear, a couple decades ago when everyone was on rim brakes for mountain bikes and cyclocross, they have been the most frustrating. The brake shutter is unavoidable on the front. The V-brakes, while they're very powerful, they're very on and off. And when I had the cantilever brakes, I just couldn't get them powerful enough. Now I mentioned it was steel and it does ride pretty nice. However, it does not ride as smooth as the Wabi Classic, which is kind of insane since I always run at least a 32mm tire on this bike, if not a 38 or 40mm tire. It still does ride nicer than my Giant TCR did, being full carbon stiff race bike, but it's not really 100% what the Classic does, which is kind of insane since you would think that a narrow tire racy style bike would be a lot harsher than a gravel cyclocross style single speed steel bike that has wider tires. It also doesn't have the same agility as the Classic does. Of course, it's a bit longer, it's a bit more relaxed being an all-road bike, not just a road racing bike. And I actually do like the geometry. I find that it's perfect. It's relaxed enough that it's not twitchy, but you could still move it very fast. It's definitely still a racy feeling bike, but it doesn't have that same get up and go as the Classic does. I've even put narrow 28mm race tires on it, and it definitely does come pretty close to the Classic. It's not quite there, and it still just does not ride as smooth as the Classic either. Now, would I buy this bike again? No. Sorry, Wabi, I love you guys, but me and this bike just didn't get along as some of your other models like the Classic behind me. It really just comes down to that if I'm gonna take a single speed bike, I'm gonna want something that's fast, that's agile, that's nimble, and a more simpler riding experience. And if I'm going to take that single speed off-road, again, it's not the right tool for the job anyway, so I'm just gonna mount 28 to 32mm tires and just do the best I can. If I do wanna go above a 35mm tire to either 38 or 40, I would just rather go with something that has proper disc brakes so that I don't have to worry about the rim brakes, and something with variable gears, since on gravel when it gets pretty loose and you start to stand up to climb, you're gonna lose a lot of traction on the back wheels. So it's kind of almost like you get the wider tire clearance with this bike, but if you do want a wider tire clearance, why not just go the full all the way and get a proper gravel bike? And you don't even have to get something that's carbon. You could just get something like a Surly Straggler, which has a 1x11 drivetrain, so you don't have the front derailleur, which keeps things simpler, but it still comes with disc brakes, which are more than likely not going to give you as many issues as mini V-brakes or cantilever brakes. Now, I've thought about selling this bike, but I don't think I am going to just yet, but definitely stay tuned because something may be coming. We may be changing this bike out, just doing a couple things just to make it a little bit better. And I'll definitely film that and post that on this channel. And now we have to talk about this bike. This is my Trek Domane SL6 2021 model. Had this bike for we're coming up on 3.5 years right now. The reason for buying it is because I wanted to get something that was a little bit more grabbable. I think we just made up a new word. Gravel capable is grabbable. But I wanted something that was a bit more capable of riding off-roads, but something that was still good on the road, since I've never really lived in a place where gravel was all over the place. I always had to ride pretty far on the road before I got to any gravel. And at the time I had my Giant TCR and my Wabi Classic, which only topped out at 32mm tires. Local bike shop at the time had this bike, 38mm tires. It fit me, so I figured let's go ahead and pull the trigger. Pros of this bike, there are lots. Number one, it looks absolutely sick in all black. I am a sucker for black beauties like this. It also has pretty insane tire clearance for an endurance style road bike, 38mm, which I have on there right now. And I've taken this bike off-road numerous times. You do not need a gravel bike if you have a bike like this that takes 38mm tires. Now, as far as being an endurance bike, it's not quite as agile as a crazy racy bike like the Wabi Classic that I've got right behind me. However, you start dropping the stem a little bit on this bike, put some nice carbon race wheels and some nice nice race tires, you're gonna have a relaxed endurance bike that's going to start to feel just about as agile as a proper race bike, but you're gonna get a lot more of those benefits of that endurance bike. Even though the frame, fork, and seat post are made out of carbon fiber, it does have aluminum alloy handlebars, aluminum alloy wheels, and a nice, robust mechanical Ultegra drivetrain, which means when you compare it to something like my TCR, which had carbon bars, Di2 electronics, carbon wheels, basically full carbon, this bike is going to be a lot more robust and it's going to survive a fall since the handlebars are going to be able to take impact a lot more. And not to mention, if you do break a derailleur, since it's mechanical, it's going to be number one, easier to source since everyone's going electronic now. And number two, a mechanical style Ultegra rear derailleur is going to be about $80 or $90 last I checked. And the same style 11-speed Di2 one is going to be about $200. And if you go with the current 12-speed, you're probably going to spend north of $300. Now, I did mention the tire clearance already, but that is one of the biggest pros of this bike. You don't need to have a gravel bike since you could just take your road bike, put gravel tires on in 38 millimeters, and you have a gravel bike. So this bike is a great jack of all trades, and if you want to just have one bike, something like a Trek Domane is going to be absolutely awesome. Now let's elaborate on that endurance road geometry. Remember when we talked about how if you don't ride a single speed bike for a long time, you're going to lose your fitness, and because this bike, the Wabi Classic, is super racy, you might lose the flexibility and not be able to put up with that super aggressive geometry. Well, something like a Trek Domane or any other bike like it just means it's going to have a lot more relaxed geometry, meaning that you can slam the stem and make it feel a lot racy. But if you take a few weeks or a few months off the bike, since maybe if it's snowing outside and you don't like riding the indoor trainer, I hate riding the indoor trainer lately, or life just gets in the way, you can simply just raise up the handlebars, you can shorten the reach, and now you're going to have a much easier time getting back into the bike or getting back into the sport. You're not going to be forced into that super racy position. And this just keeps the bike more approachable for more casual cyclists like you and me. As something else that's on the pro list, which I didn't really think was going to be a big deal, but it actually is a really nice bonus, is it has a storage compartment in the down tube, meaning that you don't have to fuss with saddlebags. I can fit 2 Tubolito inner tubes and a multi-tool in there, meaning that the way the bike is right now, I can just get on it and go and just throw in a backpack, or if I happen to be wearing cycling kit, the bike is just going to be bare, a couple of water bottles, and that's it. Just makes it a little bit easier. The hydraulic disc brakes and the mechanical drivetrain are another big pro of this bike. I was having an issue with the front shifting, the front derailleur when you were shifting into the big ring. It was super hard, but however, as you can see right here, I just took the whole cable housing out, and I was able to just wire up the housing on the exterior of the bike. Doesn't look quite as cool, but I wanted to just try this out just to see if you could do it. And you can absolutely do this in a pinch. So if you're not that great at maintenance or you don't have the tools to route everything internally through the bike, you could definitely just do something like this with some Velcro straps in a pinch, and it's going to keep the bike shifting amazingly. Ever since I did it to shift into the big ring, like you're seeing or hearing rather right now, super, super easy, even easier than shifting on the right side. So that was a con because it was so hard to shift on the left side, but ever since replacing that, not an issue at all. Never had an issue with these brakes. I probably should bleed them at some point since it's winter and I'm not riding a lot. Knock on wood, no issues at all so far. They work. Sometimes they make noise in the rain, but carbon wheels, aluminum wheels, it doesn't matter. Rain, snow, hills, this bike can do it all. Cons of this bike, well, there's not many, but the first I could think of is that it is a carbon frame, and this really is super subjective, and it depends on how you look at things. I don't have a problem with a carbon frame. I didn't like that my TCR had carbon bars because if you drop the bike, if the bike just falls over, if you're leaning it up on a wall or something like that, you're gonna break the bars, and it's just not worth it to me. So having aluminum handlebars and having a mechanical drivetrain does keep this bike more robust, and I don't think I'll have any issues with the carbon fiber cracking or breaking or doing any of those crazy things. But at the end of the day, it is still carbon fiber and is not nearly as impact resistant as steel, aluminum, or titanium. Now, the plan initially was to sell this bike and get something like a Blackheart all-road tie, but the more I think about that, that is just going to be a lot of money wasted. So my current plan is to just ride this bike, and if I don't have any issues with the frame being carbon, awesome. Just keep riding it. But if unfortunately something does happen and I do end up snapping the frame, which fingers crossed doesn't happen, going out and just getting a Blackheart all-road tie frame is going to be a lot cheaper than buying something complete from them. And I'll just be able to transfer the Ultegra 11-speed drivetrain over to that bike, which is a drivetrain that I'm really enjoying. Now, speaking of the drivetrain and the brakes, depending on how you look at this, this can be a con as well. The mechanical drivetrain did give me an issue, but now that I know how to replace the shifter cables and the shifter housing, not an issue at all. And I actually do have a tool. I'm gonna try to route this back internally just so it looks a bit nicer. So I'm totally okay riding a mechanical shifting bike and just replacing the cables once in a while. It's nice that you don't have to worry about charging your batteries and your shifters, and you either have one battery in the seat post or you have two batteries on your derailleurs. But a lot of people actually like that electronic shifting. Me, I could go either way, but depending on how you look at it, you are going to have to maintain this drivetrain a little bit more. And at the end of the day, it's going to be easier for most people to just charge up the batteries every once in a while. The hydraulic brakes on this bike are also amazing. They work perfectly. However, there is brake fluid running through this bike right now. So if I wanted to try to service them, or if I had a problem with them, number one, I can't do it in this room because I'll get hydraulic fluid all over the carpets, so I'd have to put a mat down. And I actually do have to keep a bleed kit back in that closet. So you just have to think about those things a little bit more than if you just had a regular style of cable actuated rim brakes or cable actuated disc brakes. While I do really love the look of it and it rides amazing, I mentioned that I'm not really into carbon frames as much. And if I didn't have anything and I could start all over again, since I know that I like bikes, I know that I've been riding bikes for pretty much all my adult life, I have no problem spending a little bit more for a titanium bike just to get that peace of mind that it's not going to rust like steel and it's not going to be as impact resist, or it's going to be more impact resistant than something like carbon fiber. Ride quality, I almost forgot to mention, this bike rides super smooth. Of course, it's an endurance bike, it's carbon, and this is the older model with the front and rear ISO-speed decouplers. The newer models don't have the front ISO-speed decoupler, which does mean that you lose about half a pound, I think, if I'm correct. That's definitely super noticeable. Between the Domane and my Wabi Classic, these two bikes ride super smooth. You can ride them on crazy New York City streets with a lot of potholes, no issues at all. So living with this bike, riding this bike, absolutely awesome. I would buy it again, but for me in particular, because I want to give titanium a try, I would buy something just like it in a titanium version, such as the Blackheart All-Road Tie. Now there are two more bikes that I'm going to talk about. Neither one are in my possession currently. The first is going to be my Felt VR30. It was my first ever road bike that I purchased from a local bike shop. Purchased that bike way back in 2017, rode a lot of miles on that bike. Eventually I put a pair of NB carbon wheels on it, which are right over there. That's why I just looked over here. And the bike was absolutely awesome. Shimano 105 shifters, or at the time they were the big doorknob style RS505 shifters. It had hydraulic disc, or it has hydraulic disc brakes. I still have it, just not here in the apartment. It's sitting in my mom's basement. The bike was great, shifted great, rode great. It was aluminum, or it is aluminum, but just run 28mm tires at about 80 PSI. I didn't have any issues feeling the aluminum was harsh. It was totally fine for me. And it also came with smaller chain rings up front. Instead of the standard 50-34 that a lot of endurance style bikes come in, it came with a 46-30 and an 11-32 cassette in the back. So it was really easy to tackle a lot of hills, and I found that I didn't really have to shift a lot on the front, since I, for the most part, could leave it in the 46-tooth chainring, and I only had to use the 30-tooth chainring, the small one, when I was really going up a steep hill. Compare that to something like a 50-34, I'm definitely shifting a lot more, since sometimes the 50 can be a bit too hard if you're not riding a lot or you're going around hills, but the 34 can be a bit too easy if you're doing anything other than just puttering around the block. So I had a lot of fun, rode a lot of miles on that bike. Some of the cons include those big doorknob shifters. I just didn't like the look of them after a while. And while I did ride a lot on that bike, it actually is too big for me. It's a size 58. I prefer either a size 56 like this bike is, or a size 55 like both my Wabis are. Other ones right there, so you don't think I'm just pointing to nothing. And that means I did have to put a 90mm stem on the bike, which just made it a bit weird and twitchy. It just started to handle a bit. It was just a bit off feeling, whereas a bike with a 100 or a 110mm stem is going to ride a bit nicer, such as this one right here, the Domane. While that cyan blue paint job was absolutely awesome, I didn't love the graphics. I just found it a bit too busy. Something like my Desert Turquoise Wabi Thunder is just a lot cleaner to look, since it's super simple and there's no graphics. Tire clearance on that Felt is only rated at a 30. I was able to squeeze a 35mm tire in there, but it is super close on the chainstay, so I would only go up to a 32mm tire, which does mean that it pretty much can't go much wider than this rim brake single speed Wabi Classic back here. It's just not as versatile as it could be. It was great for its time, however, tire clearances have gotten a lot bigger. I also want to mention, while I did bleed the front brake on that bike a long time ago, when I do ride that bike around the block, the brakes just don't work at all. It could be that the rotors are dirty, or I need to get new pads, or I need to bleed the brakes, but Maybe the new brakes, the new disc brakes, the Ultegra stuff is just that much better. But by far, I can't just get on that bike and ride it right now because the brakes just don't work very well. And while I don't regret the purchase, I wouldn't buy it again just because it's too big for me and that limiting tire clearance just makes it a lot less versatile than it could be. And those RS505 doorknob shifters, they're pretty ugly, but they still work, so that's not really much of a deal breaker. It's more the limiting tire clearance and the bike being too long for me. Now, as far as aluminum being harsh, I didn't find this at all, even when compared to the super smooth steel riding bike that you see back there. So if I was in the market for an aluminum road bike right now, I would either go with something like a Domane AL5, or actually I wouldn't even go there. If I was gonna go aluminum, I would go with a Trek Checkpoint ALR5, which is basically like a better version of that Felt VR30 that I still have. You're gonna get much bigger tire clearance, at least 38s. I think they can go up to 45s. You're gonna get a more updated GRX drivetrain. With that drivetrain, you're gonna get much better brakes, much better shifting, and also much sleeker brake levers. And of course, I would get it in a size 56 rather than a 58. So it would be kind of like the same thing, just fix it being too long and the tire clearance being too tight. There's one more bike I wanted to mention, the Giant TCR Advanced Pro Zero Disc. That was a great bike while I was riding it, but I recently just shipped it out to the new owner, so I don't have that bike in my life anymore. It was too big for me. The tire clearance was kind of meh. While the Ultegra 11-speed Di2 was great, you had to have the wires routed through the bars, and it looks like Shimano actually discontinues the old 11-speed Di2 stuff, so it was a lot harder to get. And I was always worried about, being locked into carbon bars with all the holes for the Di2 stuff, that if the bike fell over, there goes $300 to $500 in a pair of carbon bars, which compared to the alloy bars that are on this bike, you're not going to have that issue. And there was a video I did on this channel a little while ago saying that I was originally going to sell this Trek Domane because I just felt that it was sluggish and slow, and I always enjoyed riding the TCR. As time went on, I actually gave the Domane a bit more of a chance, and then I ended up just saying, the Domane is a better bike for me than the TCR. Fun fact number 2, I actually purchased my Wabi Thunder not only because I had such a good experience riding the Wabi Classic, I wanted a wider tire steel bike that wasn't carbon, and that was going to be sort of like a replacement for this bike. Now, a couple of other thoughts and plans for the future. I mentioned we might be doing something with my Wabi Thunder, so definitely stay tuned for that. At some point, I would like to get a metal road bike or a metal all-road bike. I mentioned a few times the Blackheart all-road tie looks like a great bike, very versatile, very nice looking bike, very expensive, but it is titanium, so you get what you pay for. But I was also looking at the Ritchie Road Logic in Sally's Macaroon, or they have this new gray color, just because I find that 32mm tires, believe it or not, don't hold me back as much as I thought, even compared to a 38mm tire. So if I'm okay riding this Wabi Classic on gravel and I find it doesn't hold me back, maybe at some point I will move to something like a Ritchie Road Logic with rim brakes. Rim brakes are great, they're simple, they're easy to maintain, but you can't run super wide tires, and if you're riding in the rain a lot, you're gonna be scraping away your wheels and you're gonna spend a lot of time sanding your brake pads down and cleaning your wheels. However, you don't need to be like me and keep a bleed kit on hand with hydraulic fluid all the time. Just a pair of cutters and a pair of Allen keys and you're good to go. You could literally just fix it on the side of the road. When most people compare rim brakes to disc brakes, they compare road style caliper brakes like this, like you see on this bike, versus hydraulic style disc brakes that you see on this bike. I would like to try cable actuated rim brakes, high end ones like TRP Spires, and put some nice Jaguar compressionless cables. It'd be super interesting to see how those really hold up, because if those can get you 95% of the power of disc brakes, then the maintenance option, it being too complicated, that argument doesn't hold water. You can still do everything with a set of Allen keys and a pair of cutters and just replace your brake cable once in a while, rather than keeping a bunch of rather than keeping a bleed kit, a bunch of fluid, a bunch of these syringes, and then having to worry about it going all over your carpeted floor in your apartment. That may take care of a lot of the complexity of the maintenance on hydraulic disc brakes. So maybe I'll build up a Blackheart all-road tie and I'll source something like a 105 or Ultegra 11-speed mechanical set that comes with rim brakes, and I'll just swap it out for TRP Spires and see how it does. Since with disc brakes you can run carbon wheels, you can run aluminum wheels, you don't have to worry about grinding your wheels away when you're riding in the rain, whereas something like rim brakes, you are. A note on riding in the rain, I always like to take the disc brakes out in the rain, or if there's a chance of the rain. I don't typically ride in the rain though. I don't look outside and say, ooh, it's raining, I'm gonna go get out there. But it's just nice to have the option. If you like riding a single speed bike like the Wabi, one workaround you could do is actually ride it as a fixed gear style bike. That way when it does rain, you can do a lot of the slowing down and stopping with just your feet. I would always recommend still run brakes just for emergency stops and actually stopping so you don't destroy your knees or hit something because you can't stop in time. But way back when I rode this bike as a fixed gear, there were a couple of rides that I just barely even touched my brakes. I just touched them for short stops once or twice in a 10-mile ride. And that was with both front and rear brakes and no foot retention at all, mind you. I do enjoy riding a single speed bike that you can actually coast. I don't mind using the brakes, but if I was commuting in all weather, I would seriously consider going back and riding this bike as a fixed gear. So those are just a couple of closing thoughts. Let me know what you think, and thanks for watching.